More on the very first and certainly a very dramatic month of Trump presidency. We are joined here in Beijing, Cui Hongjian, director and author of from the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Also in D.C., United States, we have Mr. Bradley Blakeman, Republican strategist, served on President George W. Bush's senior staff as Deputy Assistant to the President for Appointments and Scheduling. Meanwhile, in London, we are having Mr. Quentin Peel, who is an Associate Fellow with the European Program at Chatham House. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. 1 month already, can you believe it? Oh, we survived a month at least, gentlemen. So let me go to you, Mr. Blakeman. Of course, that's a joke. Let me ask you about this. You served different administrations. Are you surprised at this point, 1 month in his presidency, President Trump still is struggling internally and also about foreign policy as well?
No, I'm not. I mean, the United States is very unique. Every 4 to 8 years, we have a total transition of government. 4,000 political appointees leave. The president has no power until 12:01 on January 20th to actually be the president. Donald Trump is not a politician. He never served in government before. And in the best of times, it's organized chaos in trying to get a government together. And then you have Democrats who are preventing the president from assembling his cabinet by not giving Senate confirmation, which is needed to serve. So no, I don't think there's anything unusual about what's happening. You're having an administration form a government, and it takes time. And you're going to have some missteps, that's for sure.
Okay.
And but there are brighter times ahead, I believe.
Okay, Mr. Peel. Well, do you agree with what Mr. Blakeman just mentioned? First of all, there are political and historical precedences suggesting, well, the president coming into office, he might not function very well at the very beginning, but things will get better. And secondly, it's the Democrats that make things a little bit more than complicated. Mr. Peel.
Well, I agree and I disagree. I certainly agree that it's no real surprise for an American president to have a bumpy start. But I suspect in this case we've got the least well-prepared president, certainly in living memory, somebody who, after all, is not just at loggerheads with his own with the opposition party, the Democrats, but actually is at loggerheads with quite a significant number in his own party, the Republicans. So it's actually going to be even more difficult, I think, for him to get his act together. Having said which, he's being quite predictable. He's actually trying to do most of the things that he promised to do during his campaign. It's just that the delivery of those things is going to be much more difficult than I think he made out during the election.
And by the way, some of the promises he made during the campaign was also very dramatic to begin with. President Trump, at this point, both of you have been mentioning about whether people in the United States support him, came up short of a satisfactory approval rating after a month in office, which angered him, of course, because he ended up at the bottom of the list. If you look at history, Gallup poll over the weekend from last Saturday shows Mr. Trump received a historically low approval rating, 40%, which is 11% lower than the previous record low approval rating holder, Mr. Bill Clinton. Mr. Trump reacted to it with a tweet, of course, saying all negative polls are fake news. That's also predictable, I guess, with this president. Let me come back to you, Mr. Cui. Do you think Mr. Trump will be able to pick himself up, as well as his administration, even after this 1 month? After all, President Reagan, President Bill Clinton did not do very well at the very beginning of their presidency. Eventually, they became great presidents. And even President Reagan didn't have his foreign policy until half a year into his presidency. So, Mr. Cui, are you confident?
Yes, firstly, I think that we should perhaps give some more time to Mr. Trump, because anyway, as our American guest mentioned, he's not a professional politician. And usually it will take 3 months to half of a year to fix his foreign policy or the whole, administration to run the whole business. But at the same time, because now it's in a very, very, critical time and a sensitive time.
Right.
So I'm afraid that once we give some more time to Mr. Trump, there will be more uncertainties.
It's already enough uncertainty, isn't it? Because we don't want to forget that Mr. Trump came into office with a few black swans flew in the air, as we say.
Right.
Therefore, I want to go back to you, Mr. Blakeman. Talking about the politics in Washington, all of us understand is complicated at this point. Particularly Mr. Trump, he's not part of the establishment. Is he going to win the trust of the establishment? It seems right now he is someone the establishment both love and hate. Love because he would say something and do something the establishment wants and never dare to do. And yet hate because he managed to do things in such a dramatic way, took everybody by a bad surprise. Mr. Blakeman.
Well, I would ask the world and our country to focus on next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, the president delivers a speech before a joint meeting of Congress. And that is going to be complementary to his inaugural address. But his address to the nation is going to be more of what he hopes to accomplish in this year. And that's where he's going to either get the support or not from Congress. Because remember, laws are passed through Congress and the president either signs them or doesn't. So his agenda that he's going to announce next Tuesday night is going to be one that's very aggressive. And I think that's where you're going to see the support of Republicans come directly behind this president, because he's talking about things they care about and the nation cares about, like debt and like the budget and like taxes and immigration and our foreign policy.
Wow.
So I think the Republican Party is going to galvanize behind this president on legislation, and that you're going to see next Tuesday night.
Legislation about what, Mr. Blakeman? Is it about the Muslim ban, which can be quite controversial already in the courts, and the Republican majority leader certainly was not behind Mr. Trump at the very beginning, and he believed things should be handled in the court. Secondly, when you talk about foreign policy, you see the so-called not subscribing to two-state solution, Israelis and Palestinian issue. Also, not subscribing at the very beginning to one China policy. How much trouble that has brought to President Trump. So I don't know exactly what kind of rallying you are talking about here, Mr. Blakeman. You want to explain and be specific?
I think you've got it, you've got it wrong. It's not a Muslim ban. It's a ban on 7 countries that are failed states. This is about geography, and this is about failed states and the ability for the United States not to be able to properly vet. You talk about a one China policy. The president's policy was evolving. This is a new president. He's not bound by the policy of the United States in the past or a past president. So this president is evolving his policy based on his presidency. And he's not, again, he's not bound by any other president or any other policy. And China should know that. The most dangerous thing is to think about Donald Trump as somebody who's bound by others' policies or words. He's not.
That's very interesting. Mr. Pio, I want to come back to you on that point specifically. We've seen rhetoric coming from the White House, even different people from the White House, very differently. For example, Mr. Trump, when it comes to relations with NATO and the European Union, he expressed in one way. Well, the Vice President, Mr. Pence, just came back from the Munich Security Conference, and also his gathering with the EU leaders expresses it in a, shall I say, more than slightly different way. So we are confused, as I'm sure you are, as we are, who to listen to, who are the decision makers, and eventually who is going to have a say in the White House. Mr. Pio, what do you think of a White House at this point, quite confused from the outside at least?
Yes, I think it is. I think we don't know precisely what you say, who is calling the shots. So we hear President Trump describe NATO with a very clear word. He described it as obsolete. That means it is out of date. Its time is past. Then we hear a slightly different message from his vice president, which says that the US support for NATO is unwavering. Also a very strong word, but meaning something completely different. Now, who is actually calling the shots? It does make for a very uncertain reaction from the rest of the world, whether it's people who think that they are the allies of the United States in Europe. I think the Europeans are feeling deeply uncomfortable, or indeed for Russia, for China, for major partners in future policy. It's unclear what the new president really wants.
Well, Mr. Peel, Mr. Blakeman might argue, I'm just guessing, that well, you just don't know the grand strategy our president, President Trump, has in mind, right? Mr. Blakeman, is that what you're going to argue? That's the grand strategy to make people confused first.
No, I think what he was doing was he was shaming NATO. And as General Mattis said, now Secretary Mattis of Defense, when he was over there, is NATO's got to pull their weight. They have not been doing that which they promised to do, and that is to contribute to their own efforts. The United States has been contributing far more in excess than we should be doing. So if anything, President Trump was putting them on notice that unless they contribute, unless they change their direction and mission, that maybe NATO is obsolete today. So I think what he was doing was shaking them up, and it worked, because you know what? A lot of the countries said it's time for us to step up to the plate and do more.
Right. Shaking it up is a very vivid, shall I say, phrase Mr. Blakeman used. I think a lot of us also agree with him when he used that phrase. But the question is whether the result is likely to be satisfactory, and satisfactory to whom, Mr. Cui? So I want to come to you about that. I mean, on the one hand, you see President Trump tried, at the very beginning at least, dramatic change, for example, even on foreign policy, dramatic change on TPP as well. But when it comes to the real issues, U.S. relations with Russia, and therefore what's likely to be NATO's relations, European counterparts' relations with Russia, we see some collateral damage within the administration already. Michael Flynn is a great example of that. So, Mr. Cui, how much do you think, despite strong rhetoric coming from President Trump, is he really likely to achieve some of the grand goals he argued at the very beginning?
Yes, I think that I would like to argue with our American guest about, yes, maybe
I
we
think
can.
Mr. Blakeman is all ready for that.
Yeah, we can try to believe that Mr. Trump and his administration will go back to a normal track after maybe 3 months or half of a year.
You think?
We hope that.
Well,
but at the same time, we should not pretend nothing happened before, because as we know, regarding to the one China policy, we couldn't forget the call from Mr. Trump to the leader from Taiwan region, just like what happened after that. So I think that's the reason why we are worrying about how this change of a policy from a traditional one to a Trump's one. And of course, I think that no matter how much big of a willingness from Mr. Trump and his team, I do believe that certainly, because United States and American policy, it does have a long time tradition.
Right.
So of course we do believe that just like American guest mentioned it, certainly there will be more structural factor to influence Mr. Trump and his team.
right, we are seeing some footages, as you saw already on our screen earlier. Mr. Tillerson, the Secretary of State, meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Also, Mr. Cui, you mentioned about the important phone call between President Trump and our Chinese President Xi Jinping. Mr. Blakeman, certainly the two sides, more than before, has seemed to come with some kinds of mechanism toward communication with one another. Mr. Blakeman, two scenarios here in this part of the world people are thinking about. One is the Trump administration getting ever more sophisticated in their understanding of the status of China in this part of the region and looking for a win-win situation with China, even with the rising power as China. The second scenario people worry about is that the Trump administration is thinking about, before it announced at this point, some grand plan to hit down on China and make others stand in one team or the other. People are worried about that potential. Mr. Blakeman, briefly from you, what is your thoughts and judgment at this point?
Well, I think China has had the benefit of a very weak president for the last 8 years. and they've taken advantage of that. I don't blame them for that. It's smart to do that. But I think you've got a whole different situation. You have to reassess the relationship under a Donald Trump presidency. Donald Trump is going to blame China for everything North Korea does, and it's about time that China stood up and took responsibility for North Korea, for example. Building islands in the South China Sea for military purposes. Obama basically let that happen, and China has been able to extend their influence in that region far beyond that which is even a normal occurrence in international law. So I think China's got to reassess their relationship with America based on Donald Trump. He's like no other president that you've seen or we've seen in this country. And I think that's going to take a lot of thought and a lot of deliberation.
Mr. Cui, I want you to very briefly respond to our American guest, Mr. Blakeman, before I go to Mr. Peel.
Yes, I don't think President Obama is a weak president in history of America, but I think he's more wiser than maybe a president to promote a confrontation with China from the United States. So I do believe that yes, China and the U.S. we do share so many common interests, including the DPRK nuclear issue or some South China Sea issue or the regional security issue. So I don't think there is some game between China and the U.S. in this part of region.
Okay, very interesting. You talk about China-U.S. relations, but it's not limited to that, is it, Mr. Peel? I understand in your House of Commons, your speaker, Mr. Burkow, earlier was pretty much against Mr. Trump delivering a speech over there once he visited your country, the UK. That has a lot to do with, Mr. Peel, what kind of role the U.S. should play as aspired by the others in our world today. Mr. Peel, you want to share some thoughts with us about that?
Well, I think that the UK has got a problem. The UK is trying to distance itself and leave the European Union, and it needs all the friends it can get. So the British Prime Minister Theresa May decided at a very early stage the American president is going to be my best friend, and she rushed over to the United States and did something that no British Prime Minister would normally do. Even before he'd barely sat down in the White House, she invited him to come on a state visit to Britain. And back here in London, that looked embarrassingly feeble, if you like, that, oh my God, we've got to make best friends with this very unpredictable man in the White House. And so there was quite a backlash in popular opinion, I think, that said, hang on, don't we think we actually ought to see what sort of president he is first?
All right. Very interesting. Finally, before we go, I do want to hear your voice as well, briefly, Mr. Cui. Mr. Peel, Mr. Blakeman, both mentioned phenomena related to what America aspires to be. It's not just President Trump, it's about the supporters behind him. It's also about where America wants to be and where the world would like America to be. Isolationism was not new in American history before World War I. And now are we seeing signs yesterday once more, or are we seeing a very different direction of the United States? Briefly from you, Mr. Cui.
Yes, exactly. I think now if we recognize that we are in a very, very critical time for the change, for transformation of world order. I think if once United States want to take the position as a superpower, or maybe a leadership of the world, certainly I think Mr. Trump and his team should try to follow the tradition of American, how to take more responsibility and to, manage the competition by have some more cooperation with other places in the world.
Well, America first, that was the slogan. Whether that will be translated into one way or the other by actions, we still need to look at the only 1 month, gentlemen. We're going to have you later in our program to see more what Mr. Trump has achieved or not. Cui Hongjian, Bradley Blakeman, Quentin Peel. Thank you so much, gentlemen.